issue that we're dealing with today is science and religion. Is science the only valid way of knowing truth? So that's the question we'll look at. So once again, I'm going to have to use quite a bit of PowerPoint. Let's see. All right. And then, okay. So you should all have the PowerPoint in front of you. Is science the only way to truth? So once again, we'll explain the question in about five minutes or so. And then I have 4 responses or comments. And then after that, we can do a Q&A. And I'm hoping that I'll be done in about 30 minutes. And then we'll have about 25 minutes of Q&A. And we'll be done around 12:15 or so. Let's see. I'm sorry, I'm letting people in right now from the waiting room. So. Okay. Hopefully by next week we'll have a co-host. We're having a little bit of trouble setting that up. So. Okay. So if we look at the screen, the question is science the only way to truth? And so when we look at our culture, there is a sense in which science and religion seem to be not only in conflict, but they appear to be at war with each other. So we have that war metaphor between science and religion. And so we want to look at this question: is it necessarily the case that science and religion must be at war? So if we take a look, religion is often seen as an act of faith, and science is seen as an act of fact. So you got faith versus fact, and the two are incompatible. So look at the subtitle of Cohen's book: Why Science and Religion Are Incompatible. So that they're not the same kind of discipline. So if you can know things through science, because they're different disciplines, you cannot know things about reality, about the world, through religion. And so when we look at this, and it's not just scholars, but the general public, there is a sense in which we have a conflict. So if you look at the chart on the left, so most Americans say science and religion are in conflict, but fewer say their own beliefs conflict with science. If you look at that first chart, 59% of the people believe that there is some kind of conflict between science and religion. And then 38% believe it's mostly compatible. But when they talk about their own beliefs, the conflict, only 30% see their own beliefs conflicting with science, and then 68% not conflicting. So even 30%, that's a good number. Almost one in third hold on to a belief that's religious, that's not compatible with science. And given how committed we are to our religion and then the importance of science in our culture, that's a pretty strong dichotomy there. If you look on the right side, these are least religiously observant. So for people who attend church more, they see more harmony. So there's less likely, they see less likely that there's a conflict between science and religion. From 50% to 54% to 73%. So that in the public, there is this sense in which there is a conflict. So hang with me here. I'm still letting people in. So, okay. So let me give you 2 illustrations here of statements of conflict. So Steven Weinberger, Nobel Prize winner for physics, says, the world needs to wake up from the long nightmare of religion. Anything we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done and may in fact be your greatest contribution to society. That's a pretty strong statement. Look at the next one, Steven Pinker. The findings of science, and I have that highlighted, the findings of science imply that the belief systems of all the world's traditional religions are factually mistaken. I highlighted the word science because does Pinker mean science or does he mean scientism, the findings of scientism? So one of the things that we'll look at is, are they the same thing? Is science the same thing as scientism? Now, how should we define scientism? So if you take a look at the screen there, scientism is from J.P. Moreland. Scientism is roughly the view that the hard sciences alone have the intellectual authority to give us knowledge of reality. So truth only comes through science, this is scientism. Everything else, especially ethics, theology, and philosophy, is, at least according to scientism, based on either private emotions, blind faith, meaning there's no evidence, or cultural upbringing. That's the place where you grew up. But it has nothing to do with the way of finding truth. So my question is science in conflict with religion, or is it scientism that is in conflict with religion? It's a huge difference which one you accept. So if we look, if we have scientism, and if scientism is true, then religion cannot be its own way of finding truth. So that even if you have a religious belief, if scientism is true, then science must affirm that religious belief, or it must be jettisoned. So it's sort of like science operates like a gatekeeper. So in scientism, science acts like a gatekeeper that allows truth in and rejects false statements. So if you have a statement that's philosophical or religious, science is the gatekeeper that tells you whether you're right or not. That's scientism. So in our particular culture, we have a conflict between science and religion. So I'm going to argue today, it's really not science, it's scientism. But if scientism is true, then science takes the place of God. That's how I see it, is that religion will die out if scientism is true. In fact, if you look at the coronavirus, this is an article from Ford magazine, and I sliced out 2 paragraphs because there's a strong sense of hope in science. So when we look at the crisis that we are in, and we all pray as Christians because we believe ultimately it's in the hands of God, but for others, it's science that provides the hope. So take a look at the left paragraph. We no longer live in an era where we have to rely on assumptions or superstitions to understand what's occurring. One might almost put parentheses there, religion. We know what the novel coronavirus COVID-19 is, right? Science. We know how it spreads through the human population. We know how to fight it, how to treat it, how to minimize the death rate from it. It's not only time to listen to what science tells us about it, but to understand the 3 ways the scientific world has enabled the best of humanity's response. From that paragraph, it gives the spirit that it's science where our hope is, and for the vaccine ultimately, so that we can go back to a normal life. Now take a look on the right side. On the right side, the novel coronavirus crisis is having a tremendous impact on our world at the present time, but our response can demonstrate just how far we have come as a civilization. Because of science progressing, we're also progressing as a civilization. The entire universe obeys the same scientific rules, and the better we study it, the better prepared we will be for the challenges that come our way. Not just this virus, but viruses in the future, and not just this crisis, but other crises. The investments we make today will lead to tomorrow's knowledge, and in turn, the day after tomorrow's tools and techniques that lead to a better world for all of humanity. And it almost sounds like, yeah, it's not religion that will make the world a better world, but it is science that is the hope for a world, a better world to come. So, and in fact, today, especially after the 9/11, you have not only religious beliefs that may be based upon emotions or superstition, but religious beliefs can be dangerous because they're not rational, because rational beliefs have evidence. So that if religious beliefs have no evidence, it's irrational, and irrational people do irrational things. So that's sort of the setup for the question. And I have 4 responses here, 4 responses. So response number 1, there are some scientists who are religious. Now, it sounds like an obvious statement, but I want to put this in because I'm trying to drive a wedge between science and scientism. So there are some scientists who affirm science as a viable way of knowing truth, and there are some scientists who are religious and hold on to religion as a viable way of knowing truth. So I'm going to drive a wedge between science and scientism. I'm going to argue they're not necessarily the same thing, and that it's scientism that is in conflict with religion, not science. So 3 illustrations of religious scientists, and they're all Christians here. Now, I start by saying that there is a God who created the universe, and he is not an impersonal God. So MIT professor Daniel Hastings. Secondly, Jin Kong from MIT. My research is only a platform for me to do God's work. His creation, the way he made this world, is very interesting. It's really amazing. So science is one way of knowing what God created and how he created the world. And then lastly, Andrew Gossler from Oxford, my coming to faith in Christ did not rest on a single issue, such as the value of life. It was a holistic redefining of perspectives that came together through every aspect of my life, so that science is subsumed under the totality of how he views the world through his religious framework. In fact, if you take a look at the last 100 years of Nobel winners, so it's a very interesting statistic. 65% of all Nobel laureates from 1901 to I think 2001 were Christians. In fact, if you look at the various categories, 78.3 for the Peace Prize, and then 72.5 of those who won the chemistry Nobel Prize were Christians, 65% in physics, 54% in economics, 49.5%. Those are pretty high numbers. In fact, if you look at all religions, what you'll see is that about 90% of all Nobel Prize winners in the last 100 years had religious background, and only 10% were atheists or agnostic or free thinkers. That's a pretty high percentage. Now, I'm not trying to demonstrate the majority of scientists or religions. That's not what I'm trying to do. All I'm saying is that there's a healthy portion of scientists who are recognized that affirm both science and religion, okay? So now there are surveys that seem to indicate also that a minority of scientists are religious. So 34% of science professors at elite universities say they do not believe in God. And 30% of scientists are agnostic, so 64% are not religious. But here's the kicker, but when asked for why they did not believe in God, very few referred to science. In other words, it wasn't science that drove them away. For the majority of scientists I interviewed, it was not engagement with science itself that leads them away from God. Now, the next few slides deal with scientists in Britain. So this is a survey of British Royal Society. And what they did was they sent out questionnaires to like 255 of the members, asking their position on various religious questions. And then of the questionnaires that were returned, and there were about 130 questionnaires that came back, so that the line on the left, that's the number of affirmatives or responses from the questionnaire. So you see on the left side to the question, I believe that there is a strong likelihood that a supernatural being such as God exists or has existed. Strongly disagree. The physical sciences, you have it in blue, and then the biological sciences, you have in the pink. So that a good, strong majority of British scientists who are members of the Royal Society do not believe in the existence of God. And then they color-coded it to show you that it's biological sciences where a lot of the disagreement arise as well. And then is God personal? Same thing on the left side. You see that huge majority there. And then on the next slide, is there life after death? And then a majority of the respondents said they strongly disagree. Now, I'm going to end this with Francis Collins. So Francis Collins is a very vocal Christian, and he's quite well known. He's the director of the National Institute of Health, and has in fact written a book, The Language of God. And so here what we have is a Christian, and he's a vocal Christian, who is a well-known scientist. And his story is a little bit interesting because what he says in the book is that he was an atheist when he went off to college, and then when he became a junior doctor, his atheism was challenged. His atheism was challenged by when he was rotating through his internship. There was an older woman who was suffering from severe and untreatable pain, and she began to share her faith with him in Jesus. And she asked him one day, "Doctor, what do you believe?" And he says, "I felt my face flush." And then he stammered the words, "I'm not quite sure." And that one question from that elderly lady sharing her faith and asking him about his faith, he began this journey of exploring Christianity, looking at its claims, and he ended up accepting Jesus Christ. And he goes on to write that the God of the Bible is the God of the genome. And so here we have an illustration of a vocal Christian who's also a well-known scientist. And I just thought it was really neat that an elderly woman who is deeply in pain, just by asking him a simple question, "I believe in Jesus. What do you think about God? Do you believe in God?" triggered this exploration. And then he became a Christian and is making an impact in our society today. So point number one, there are some scientists who believe that religion provides a viable way of knowing truth. Now, the second response, there's a difference between science and scientism. That's why you can have some scientists who are religious and affirm science, because they affirm science, but not scientism. So the question is, what's the difference between the two? Okay. I just put this up as an informal definition. So there are different ways of defining science. Science is a systematic way of organizing and interpreting data to reach a falsifiable conclusion with limited number of assumptions about what that conclusion ought to be. So whether you agree fully with this definition or not, in general, it captures different elements of science. In this sense, I have no problems with science. It's scientism that I have a problem. So scientism is an ideology. It is a philosophical principle which dictates the kinds of conclusions a scientific method can produce through a priori assumptions. In other words, before the method is employed, you make certain assumptions about the world so that the method only spits out certain kinds of conclusions. See, to me, that's not a scientific method. That's an ideology. The front end determines what you'll get on the back end. Okay. So I'm going to illustrate this with Richard Dawkins. Now, Richard Dawkins, you probably heard of him as well. He wrote The God Delusion, which became a bestseller, and he's sort of known as the godfather of the new atheist. Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and others, after the 9/11, they became far more vocal. And in fact, he's so popular that my daughter Katie wanted to go and hear him lecture. He came to Northwestern, and she wanted to hear him. So 15 minutes after the tickets went on sale, she clicked to buy, and it was already sold out. He is very popular, especially on our college campuses. And he wrote a book that's entitled The Blind Watchmaker. And this book is used in a number of college courses on the theory of evolution. Now, The Blind Watchmaker, he's working off of Paley's argument that if you're walking through a field and you find a watch and you see that the watch is designed because it has interrelated complex parts for a purpose, then it has to be a designer. He's arguing for the blind watchmaker. And look at the subtitle. Why the evidence of evolution reveals a universe without design. Now, that's an interesting statement. In my opinion, science cannot conclude that there is no design. it can argue for the presence of design, but not the lack of design, because I'm not sure how he would deal with theistic evolution in that statement. In fact, I would argue that Dawkins is engaged in scientism, not science, just by the subtitle. But if you look at his book, this is in the preface. So take a look at the preface and what he writes. Moreover, I want to persuade the reader, not just that the Darwinian worldview happens to be true, but that it is the only known theory that could, in principle, solve the mystery of our universe. See, that to me is scientism, because it has a front-loaded assumption that only evolutionary theories can be true, and therefore, no matter how much you scientifically investigate the origin of life, it will always spit out a naturalistic theory, an evolutionary theory. Now, this is not the only place he writes this. In the last chapter of the book, page 287, he says, my argument will be that Darwinianism is the only known theory that is in principle capable of explaining certain aspects of life. If I am right, it means that even if there were no actual evidence in favor of the Darwinian theory, see, that's huge to me. Now, it says there is, of course, evidence for Darwinian theory, but even if there was no theory, we would be justified. See, to me, science produces true conclusions only when it provides evidence as the method of justifying its truthfulness. But here he argues that even if there's no actual evidence, it would still be justified in preferring it over all rival theories, because he's not engaged in science, he's engaged in scientism. Now, take a look at this quote. This is from Richard Lewalton. He's an evolutionary biologist, had the chair of zoology and biology at Harvard University. And he makes, this is a New York Review of Books, and he makes this statement that's very enlightening. He says, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories. What he means is that, when evolution is trying to explain certain adaptations and species, they construct a story, and even when the story doesn't seem to fit or is outlandish, they still accept it because evolution has to be true before the scientific investigation. So notice what he says there. Because we have a prior commitment, front-loaded, the assumption that materialism is true. And if materialism is true, then at least Christianity must necessarily be false. Not because of science, but because of the fundamental assumption. Continuing on, it is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomena world. See? He's not saying science led to materialism. Instead, it's the reverse. But on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence, right, before the method is employed, to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, naturalistic explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. That's amazing for me. If you remember last week, we talked about the God of the gaps, that sometimes early in our civilization, when something occurred that we weren't able to explain, a gap, we invoke the name of God. So here, if you allow God to explain one event, then what's to keep God from explaining many events? So you prevent God from filling any of the gaps. But if that's your a priori assumption, then you will never have God involved in the world at all. Not as a result of science, but as a philosophical commitment prior to employing the methods of science. That's scientism. That's ideology. In fact, take a look here. This is Carl Sagan. And Carl Sagan is one of the most well-known scientist. So take a look at his statement on the left. You can't convince a believer of anything, for their belief is not based on evidence. It's based on a deep-seated need to believe. Now, he's talking about religious people, but I'm going to flip this around and say, you know, I can't convince Carl Sagan of religious beliefs because his belief in scientism is an a priori assumption. So just take a look at this clip. We're going to make sure this clip works. Let's see. 1 second on the clip. Let's share screen. Optimized share. Here we go. And please let me know if you can't hear. Oh, I'm having problems.
The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. Our contemplations of the cosmos stir us. There's a tingling in the spine, a catch in the voice, a faint sensation as if a distant memory of falling from a great height. We know we are approaching the grandest of mysteries.
Now, I would argue that his opening statement, in fact, the whole first 30 seconds of the Cosmos, the PBS special, is more religion than it is actually science. His statement that the cosmos is what is, the cosmos what was, and what will ever be sounds almost, it is a doxology to the cosmos. And it is not the result of the scientific method. As Richard Lewalton would argue, that's the front-ended assumption that the cosmos is all there is. In fact, if you look at the way it's set up, so let's say the origin of life, that's where my dissertation was on the origin of life. If you look at the question of how did life arise, and then you have the scientific methods of scientists who are going and investigating chemical evolution, let's say. On the left side, if only natural causes are allowed to compete as the best explanation for the origin of life, then you are no longer engaged in science, you are engaged in scientism, because you have front-loaded all explanations for the origin of life to being materialistic or naturalistic. And in fact, if you take a look here, that's Watson and Crick, as most of you are aware. Watson and Crick won the Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine for discovery of the helix structure of the DNA. Crick has gone on to work on a book. So Crick has been working on the origin of the DNA. He did. On the left side, he says, life itself, its origin and nature. What he's found is that he cannot come up with any naturalistic theories for the origin of life. So on the right side, page 88, it says, an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have been satisfied to get it going. So now, does he leave open, let's say, a gap for God to come and create life? Or does he opt for something else? Now, he opts for what is known as directed panspermia. So what that is if you take a look at the book cover, see the picture of the Earth, and then you have something in orbit that crashes onto the Earth. So in the book, what he argues is if life didn't arise here on, let's see, if life did not arise here on Earth, then it must have arisen somewhere else in the universe. So what he argues is that there was this world. Now he has no evidence for it, but there's this world out in the universe somewhere where life had evolved and became very complex, and then something like perhaps a supernova of their sun will occur. And so in order to keep life going in the universe, what they did was they put all the hardiest form of life, so let's say bacteria, virus, and they put it in a canister and they sent the spaceship out into the universe. And when that spaceship detects a habitable planet, what it does is it will revolve around it, and then it will jettison the canister. And when the canister falls below a certain atmospheric pressure, what it does is it releases the bacteria and the viruses, and those bacteria that fall onto favorable environment will then reproduce, and those that do not will die out. Because what Crick is having problem is explaining the origin of the DNA. If you can have some type of explanation for the DNA, he feels that the evolutionary theory can explain evolution on the macro level, but not on the chemical level. And so what you have here, and when I read this, it doesn't seem like, well, it isn't science. It's actually, it's science fiction. It's scientism, because he will not go outside the universe for any causal explanation for the origin of the DNA. In fact, we have this somewhat with the origin of the universe itself, the Big Bang, which was coined by Fred Holt as a derogatory term for the universe beginning, but because the beginning of the universe smacks of creation. And so there was much hesitancy in accepting scientific theories and mathematical equations. For Einstein's equation on general theory of relativity, he played around with it so that it wouldn't imply a beginning of the universe. But we have it here as well, that the origin of the universe doesn't need God. And Stephen Hawking would be a huge proponent of that today. But it's not because of science that it's led to that, it's scientism. In fact, this is a famous quote from Robert Jastrow. And Jastrow writes, "For the scientist who has lived by faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountain of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." For the majority of the centuries, scientists had held on to the eternality of the universe or steady state theory, but now the beginning of the universe seems to smack of religion, creation, and that's why there's such a bias against it. So there's a difference between science and scientism. Science is a method. Scientism is a scientism is an ideology that front loads that method, so that it only spits out certain kinds of conclusions. Okay. Then the third response: not all that goes by the name of science is equal. This is an important distinction to keep in mind, so that there are different kinds of science. So we're going to split into two different kinds. On the left, you have operational science, this is experimental science. And in experimental science, you have the science that develops the technology. And then on the right side, you have historical science. And historical science generally goes back in time to try to explain how certain things originated. That would be either the universe or life or various species or our consciousness. So that if you take a look at something like this, and you may have seen shirts like this as well. Evolution is just a theory, right? A lot of evangelicals may say that. The comeback is, then again, so is gravity. And that comes from Richard Dawkins. To me, the problem here is not the word theory. The problem is that evolution is one kind of science and gravity is another kind of science. Evolution is a historical science. Gravity is an operational science. The two are not exactly the same. In fact, if you look at this chart, there are differences between these two kinds of science. Operational science is familiar with chemistry, physics, biology. Historical science would be archaeology, geology, paleontology, and let's say origin of life, origin of the universe. They're all historical sciences. On the left side, operational science is repeatable events. and the event itself is observable, right? So let's say in a laboratory type condition, perhaps. On the right is singular events, and we're observing not the event itself, but the residual effects of those events. That's historical science. And then in operational science, in search of laws of nature which describe the event. So that's what we're trying to find. Laws of nature would describe the cause and the effect. But in historical science, you're in search of the causal conditions that gave rise to the event. You're not necessarily looking for laws. You're looking for the causal conditions by which that event occurred. And then in operational science, there's a high degree of certainty. That's why we go to hospitals and trust chemists. That's a high degree of certainty, and low number of assumptions is necessary to get the method going. But on the right side, there's a low degree of certainty and a high number of assumptions that are necessary because we don't know all the exact conditions for, let's say, the origin of life. You have to make assumptions in order to come up with a causal explanation. And then on the left side, if you have cell division, on the right side, you have macroevolution, the origin of a species. On the left side, if you have thermodynamics, on the right side, you would have origin of the universe type questions. The two are both may go under the name of science, but they're not the exact same kind of science. In fact, if you look, what are the major debates between science and religion today? Evolution and creationism would be huge. So when I look at this, it's not operational science against religion. It's some of the historical science conclusions that are against religion. And then the age of the earth, right? Old earth, young earth, and we have this entire debate. Once again, this is a historical science issue, not an operational science. So that I don't have a problem with operational science. It's sometimes when historical science makes certain conclusions, I am free to disagree with it if my interpretation of scripture leads me otherwise, because the degree of certainty is not as high as operational science. But now I'm going to give a word of warning here, because if you have scientism on one side, I think there are fundamentalist Christians who are too fanatical on the other side. So you may disagree with me, and that's fine. But this is from an apologetic website. And so look at the way it reads. The Bible implies that the earth is around 6,000 to 10,000 years old, while the conventional belief held by many is that the earth is 4.5 billion years old. Is the Bible wrong about the age of the earth? Abundant evidence exists from the disciplines of paleontology, archaeology, geology, astrophysics, and geophysics, which support the biblical time frame while refuting deep time. Now, I have a problem here, not so much his conclusion that the earth is 6,000, 10,000 years old. I'm not going to touch that right now. But his suggestion that the Bible implies, and therefore the Bible teaches young earth, I think he has to be careful here. It's not the Bible that teaches the age of the earth. It's my interpretation of certain passages of the Bible that leads to the conclusion of a young earth. We do not want to collapse our interpretation with the Bible itself. Now, hang on to that point with me, because I think that's crucial. It's not the Bible that teaches. We have to be careful. It's my interpretation of the Bible that teaches, because all scripture and every text when it is read has to go through a process of interpretation. So when I see things like this, creation versus fake science, now I understand they disagree with some of the conclusions of historical science, but fake science, I think we're pushing the boundaries here and creating conflict where the intensity of the conflict may not need to be to that degree. So that when I look at the news, right, a spoiler alert, Jesus wasn't vaccinated, and then you got the demonstrations that want the states, people who want the states to open up sooner than later. Jesus is my vaccine. I feel like these kinds of statements stir up a conflict between science, operational science, with religion, and I get weary when I see these types of signs, especially with operational science. And part of the reason why I get weary is because of this. Barna Group, 6 reasons why young people leave the church. One of the reasons, anti-science, because they see the church as being anti-science. Up to 1/3 say the church is out of step on scientific developments and debate. We want to be careful that when our interpretation of the scriptures lead us to a particular conclusion, and science, in particular historical science, leads to another conclusion, yes, we should stand up for the interpretation. Yeah, I'm going to put that in quotes there. There has been a few times in history where interpretations have been changed because what historical science has discovered. But you should stand up for your interpretation. But if that leads to a minimizing or fake science, what that does is it creates a degree of conflict between science and religion that doesn't necessarily have to be there. And when our young people pick it up, it feels like the church is out of step. So I'm arguing for a balance. We don't want scientism, but we don't want a fundamentalism that impugns science either. That there needs to be some form of middle ground. My last point, I think I'm running out of time, or half. My last point, there are limits to what science can tell us. What this does is, science is good at certain kinds of phenomena, natural phenomena, that's looking for causal explanation, especially repeatable. But there are other areas of life at which science can't speak to. And in those areas, philosophy should kick in, ethics should kick in, and religion should kick in, so that what you have are multiple disciplines that are applied to the nature of the phenomena that best is served by that particular methodology. Okay. So quick illustrations here of some areas. Number one, ethics science can provide causal explanations and provide descriptive laws, but it cannot tell us how the world ought to be, nor how we ought to live in a moral sense. Science deals with is types of statements, present descriptive statements and past events, but it cannot tell us about how we ought to live our lives in the sense of what is right and what is wrong. That's under the theory of ethics. And if you look at scientists who are willing to concede that, so Michael Ruse is an atheist philosopher of science specializing in evolution, he'll tell you morality is a biological adaptation. There's no such thing as absolute ethics, morality. It's a biological adaptation no less than our hands and feet and teeth that help us to survive. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusionary. I appreciate when someone says, love your neighbor as thyself. They think they're referring above and beyond themselves to a higher, a transcendent realm where these absolute ethics reside. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusionary. Ethics is outside of the realm of science, and so is the meaning of life. The meaning of life cannot be answered by scientific theories. In fact, it's the philosophy that deals with meaning of life, especially existential philosophy. So that if you have two competitors, as on the left, the meaning of life is happiness, Dalai Lama, or on the right, life is without meaning. You bring your own meaning to it. The meaning of life is whatever you describe it to be. Being alive is the meaning itself. This is a philosophical question. This is a religious question, not a scientific question to arbitrate which one is the right one. And then the third one, and this is one that's a pretty strong argument, the incredible effectiveness of mathematics in describing the universe. Why is it that math, which is not something that's discovered in a materialistic worldview, math is not discovered, it's invented, so that these are ideas within the mind, why is it that it fits so well in describing our universe, the language of mathematics? And so you have somebody like Einstein. Now, Einstein is very tricky. He's not an atheist, but he's not a theist either. Some argue that he's a pantheist. I think he's somewhere in that space, but he's certainly not an atheist or a materialist. says, how can it be that mathematics, being after all a product of human thought, which is independent of experience a priori, is so admirably appropriate to the objects of reality? This is one of the reasons why he did not embrace materialism or naturalism. So that Wagner had written this famous essay, Eugene Wagner, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in Natural Science. This is a huge question of which science assumes the language of mathematics applying to the cosmos, but it cannot prove the effectiveness of mathematics. Why is it that that's the case? That's a philosophical, religious issue, not a scientific issue. In fact, if you look at this, this is called foundationalism. So what you have are beliefs that we hold on top. So at the top of the building are the beliefs that we hold because of evidence. You have arguments for it. Those beliefs are supported by evidence, and those evidence are supported by other evidence, but you can't go back forever. So you can't do an infinite regress. At some point, you have to have some beliefs that you start or initiate the chain of reasoning, but which itself is not justified or argued by prior beliefs, because you can't have an infinite regress. So we call these beliefs basic beliefs. They're basic assumptions. And these assumptions is what gets the scientific method started. Science doesn't argue for the assumptions. Instead, it's the assumptions that enable the method to take off. So on the left side, I have several illustrations of basic assumptions. The uniformity of nature. That nature is orderly and regular is not a result of science. It's what gets science started. Theories of justification. What does it mean for the scientific method to prove that something is true? Theories of justification is an epistemic issue and a branch of epistemology. The meaning of truth. So science spits out true statements. What do we mean by truth? That's a philosophical issue. The laws of logic, the reliability of sense experience. So that when I'm looking at the world, when I'm smelling the world, am I sensing it as it is? How do we know my experience of it is true to the reality of the world? See, those are all philosophical questions. In fact, if we're not careful, scientism can be self-refuting. So if scientism is the claim that only science is a valid way of gaining truth, then how do we come to know this very truth? Is it through science? I'm not sure of any scientific method that's able to produce this kind of statement, because this is a philosophical statement. In fact, we would call these self-refuting statements. So on the right, nothing is carved in stone, is carved in stone. If that statement is true, it must necessarily be false because the statement is about itself. In that sense, it's cutting yourself, the limb on which you are sitting in. So that scientism, if it's not careful, is self-refuting. Science needs other disciplines in order for the method to be kicked off. In fact, this is my last slide. The belief that God created an orderly world for the human mind. So if God created the world and the human mind, and let's say language and mathematics, I believe God created language, the language of music, the language of mathematics, and linguistics language as itself as well. The belief that God created an orderly world for the human mind to understand and cultivate. So the command is, right, we're created in his image, and we're to go and we're to reign over and cultivate, to keep the world, the garden, the world. He has given us a mind to understand the world, and the world is of such a nature that it can be understood by the mind. See, this bridging between the two is a fundamental assumption that scientists, naturalistic scientists have to make. And Alvin Plantinga wrote this argument that in evolutionary theory, there's no guarantee that the mind evolved in such a way to know truth because it's after survival. Only in Christian theism can you have the bridging of the two with a God who created both with his intended purpose that human minds can understand the world. And so that's the lecture portion. And if I were to summarize it really quickly, that there are scientists who are Christian because science is not the same as scientism. Scientism is an ideology. and that even in science, there's historical science and there's also operational science. And I have no problem with operational science. It's historical science where some of its conclusions may conflict with our interpretation. And when they do, you have to ask, how much evidence is the historical science spitting out versus how strong is my interpretation of the scriptural passage? Both are in question. And then lastly, there are certain things that science cannot respond to. And it needs other discipline, i.e. religion, philosophy, ethics. Boy, okay. That's it. Please, the lecture part is over, and maybe for about 10, 15 minutes, we can dialogue if you like. And you don't just have to ask questions, please. You're welcome to make comments because, you know, in this church, every other person I meet has a PhD in something. So even when I'm preparing this thing, I'm thinking, wow, there's probably a PhD in physics and PhD in chemists. And I'm like, oh my God, they're gonna call me on anything that I say. So it was with fear and trembling that this lecture was developed. So I'm happy if you want to contribute. I'm happy to be corrected as well, because with a group like you guys, it's a definite learning experience for me as well. So, all right. Any thoughts, comments, or?
I have
Matteo, go ahead.
Yeah. So thanks for the comments of preparation. So I have lots of questions. Sorry, 1 second. My son was hijacking the conversation. No, Ben, you cannot speak now. I apologize. Yeah, so I want to say, I have many questions, but I ask two. So I agree that the extremism on both the science and the religion side are implausible. To be charitable, maybe the uncomfortable feeling that some defenders of science as opposed to religion are trying to convey, not always successful, is the following, that we should commensurate our intellectual commitments to evidence, and religious people typically makes bold claims about things that sometimes are spiritual, sometimes are physical, like time of the universe, biological mechanism like evolution and so on. And pretty much all these claims are without evidence that one can share and control between different subjects, as opposed to a private revelation, and this is not okay. So you are entitled to believe whatever you want, but what they're trying to say may be that it's not serious if you don't have evidence that we can control as a community. We should just say something's a mystery and don't make these claims. So there may be the opposition that some people see between religion and science. So I wonder, what do you think to be if there's some opposition in the method, in the way in which we collect, use evidence, in which we exclude false beliefs in the religious sphere? And I give just one example, and then I give back to you. So you mentioned this age of the universe, which, and you said, let's be cautious, don't attribute to the Bible, but maybe to some interpretation of the Bible, it's fine.
Some interpretations,
yeah. So we went to the South Pole and we drill into you probably know these things, we drill into the ice, and we found 200,000 layers of ice that was formed in summer. We can recognize because there are some bubble of air that gets trapped during the summer. They don't get trapped there into the winter. So that means there have been 200,000 summer that have passed. So that means 200,000 years have passed. So is this evidence? It can be, we may discover later we did a mistake. Everything can be revisable. I may subscribe to that. We can find there was some problem with the instruments, fine. But as it stands now, suppose that we did our duty, we checked the instrument, would that count as pretty good evidence that the Earth has more than 6,000 or 10,000 years old?
So that's a great question. It raises a whole host of issues. And so remember, I'm trying to do a middle ground here. I don't want to embrace scientism, right? It's front-loaded in such a way that you're going to have materialism as your conclusion. But I don't want to be a fundamentalist in the sense that I don't change my interpretation when I'm faced with evidence that seems convincing enough. So Matteo picked out the age of the universe, and that's a good one because it's not the same as evolutionary theories, so macroevolution. For me, there seems to be more evidence for a long, the universe being 15 to 20 billion years, than there is for macroevolution. So it's not just the Hubble telescope and the discovery of the redshifting of the galaxies, right? That they're expanding outward. But is it in 1953 or 54, the cosmic background radiation was discovered? And then you're mentioning the layers of snow in Australia. So at least for me, that's enough evidence that I think the universe is 15 to 20 billion years old. So I changed my interpretation of text given the evidence that I received. Now, I haven't done that for theories of evolution, biological evolution, and certainly chemical evolution. They're really far off right now from coming up with any plausible scientific theory that's accepted by the majority, but I have shifted. Now, I did tell you before that is, Luther had this statement, Martin Luther in the 1500s had this statement that the earth is flat, the earth is flat. And then the more evidence came in, he changed his interpretation that the earth is spherical. So in this instance, it's not a principle, it's case by case. I look at the evidence from, let's say, historical science, operational science, and then I look at my interpretation of the text. And I ask myself, which one should I hold given the amount of evidence and the degree of certainty of my interpretation? And when I'm looking at Genesis 1 to 3 and age of the earth and theories of evolution, Genesis 1 to 3 is not written as a scientific text. Now, I'm not disagreeing with ICR and Ken Ham of their conclusion, but I do hugely disagree with them that the genre of Genesis 1 to 11 is historical and a scientific text. It's a creation narrative that models ancient Near East creation accounts. And what it's doing is it's a polemic against them, that God is like this in contrast to and compared to other creation accounts. So I would disagree hugely there. But to answer your question, yeah, evidence from science can and sometimes should change interpretations of scripture, especially when it comes to areas that are, let's say, gray. And I'll give you one last statement. Augustine had this statement in Confessions. In chapter 12, he talks about the Genesis and the age of the earth. Augustine was a long ager, so he didn't believe that the earth was short age, but long. And he says that if Christians reject evidence of science when it's pretty clear, it actually decredits. It minimizes the credibility of the gospel, because the same people who are saying the gospel is true cannot accept some of the evidences from the scientific community that seems pretty clear. But as you know, Matteo, even in this church, as I found out, I was like, how long have I been here at this church? And I thought, wow, it feels like years, but it's actually only been 3 months, I think, 4 months, 3 months. And I realized, boy, there are people who hold on to so many different positions on these issues at this church that it's a personal case by case, I think. Yeah, it's a personal issue. And then it's case by case, which issue that you want to talk about. Yeah. I'm sure you know. Matteo created a chat room. the chat room of me and him. So
Right.
anyone else want to join, I will send that out Wednesday, the link to the chat room, and we can have discussions here. But I thought about adding one more question. Is the universe 15 to 20 billion years old? Matteo, it's not just from Genesis chapter 1 to 3. For me, I am convinced by the Bible that it's not 7 literal days of creation in Genesis 1. From John chapter 5 and Hebrews chapter 4, I can make a pretty good case that the seventh day Sabbath is not a 24-hour period, it's an extended period of time. So when I have a biblical way of interpreting the text and I have scientific evidence that seems to apply a longer age, then I made the shift. And that's a big shift for me because I'm working in an evangelical fundamentalist community like at Moody. To make that shift, you take a couple of number hits. But you did mention, the 200,000 years in the snow layer, the common response from the other side, that God created the world with an age of appearance. Right?
Yeah,
So,
I know that, but then that's exactly the point. So how we use evidence. So we can always make up a story with enough fantasy.
Well, I don't want to say make up a story. That's almost...
No, I mean, also a Muslim or a Buddhist or pick the religion you want, with enough fantasy could always fit the data into a complicated enough story that nobody can verify or falsify.
And will you grant that science does the same thing at different times? Right? Just Richard Lewontin, the outrageous just so stories to make evolutionary theory come true. They also accept things because if you're gonna wrap the whole thing in naturalism, there's certain things that cannot be explained by naturalism. They're gonna force it in. So in that sense, scientism is an ideology just like Christianity is. And I can't convince Dawkins to switch, but Dawkins will never convince me to switch either. Because my faith is not based on evidence. I don't care whether they're arguments for the resurrection or the historicity of Jesus Christ. I'm a pastor and a Christian because I have an intuitive experience of God at different times of my life that I cannot let go. Once I let go, I lose my sense of who I am. And so it's not because of evidence. Therefore, no amount of evidence you give me against Christianity will affect me, just like for Dawkins, it's the same thing. In fact, quick illustration, the guy that directed Avatar, James Cameron, he did a special on PBS on how they discovered the ossuary. That's the container where they hold the bones of dead people. They had discovered the ossuary of Yasu, and they think it was Jesus because it was connected to a couple of different names in the Bible. And I looked at that and I thought, that's not it, because Jesus rose from the dead. How do I know? Because he lives in my heart. Is that an evidential argument? No, it's a gut instinctive experience. But I would argue that a lot of scientists who operate with scientism do the same thing because it's ideology. Especially, Matteo, given that Enlightenment rationality is on the demise and the downward slope, and we may not be in a full postmodern rational framework, but we're certainly not in an Enlightenment objectivity and our bias can be eliminated in the rational evaluation of argumentation and evidence. Because when you say evidence, you don't mean just facts. You mean interpretation, right? All evidence has to be interpreted. And so that's where I believe scientism and religion are in the same boat.
Right, I don't want to defend scientism,
right.
Or even science. For me, it's a pretty complicated beast. So that's why I was using evidence as a sort of label for how a serious truth seeker should try to commensurate its own beliefs to the best that person can, to what track truth outside. That's a very complicated thing.
Oh, it is. I'll just close with this and then I'll open up to others, because we actually can't talk about evidence. We're going to have to talk about theories of justification. And as you may be aware, in epistemology, theories of justification is the most debated topic there is. And we don't even agree on theories of justification right now. And so we would have to go to that level to begin unteasing some of these issues. which you and I can do in the chat room of just me and you.
Yeah. I just say the last things, then I really want to let other people. It's all these things are true. That still doesn't mean that we cannot recognize in a reasonably solid way what is unjustified.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So,
yeah. I agree. That's why I'm trying to find that balance there. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. I let others speak. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Are there
Thanks,
any other
Pastor.
questions, comments? It's 12:20 and going once, going twice. Well, you're welcome to join us in our chat room, and I hope you have a wonderful lunch each in your own homes, and hopefully, we'll see you next week. Next week is on religious pluralism. So, does all religion lead to the same truth? And that's a huge question in a postmodernist type of mindset we have, especially with our young people and college students. So, okay. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Pastor Rim,
Bye-bye.
Pastor Rim, where will the recording be posted?
Oh, yes, I did. Yes, I'm going to pause this.